All right. Hello there, Adrian.
Hi, Jude. Hello.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak to me today. It's a real honor. Obviously, we've known each other for many years, but we've also done all sorts of fun projects, working on and off for different companies we've worked for. But basically, for anyone who doesn't know Special Projects, you're a very, very unique London based company that specializes in really incredible user experience. And we're going to get onto this, but usually people say, oh, they're quite magical. You guys actually have some of that in your DNA. So this should be a really exciting thing to talk about. But would you mind just taking it from the top about how you came into design and what you do today?
Sure. So yeah, thanks for having me on the show. So I'm originally an electronic engineer, so I kind of had quite a nerdy sort of upbringing. And then when I finished my sort of first degree in electronic engineering, I just kind of didn't feel very comfortable with being just purely an engineer. So I started looking for things to do, things to learn about, and I came across this amazing sounding course in London at the Royal College of Art, which is basically like a Mad Inventors course, which I know you know about because you also went there. But for those who don't know much about it, I mean, it really was a course that promised to take about half of its students from science and engineering backgrounds and the other half from sort of artistic backgrounds and sort of mash them all together for 2 years and teach them how to be inventors. So that's kind of how I got into design, through this amazing course. And I sort of slowly discovered what design was like as I was doing the course. I really kind of was learning the whole time, and I'm still, if I'm honest, like still discovering, what it is right now. And so I was very lucky. I met my wife, also an amazing designer, Clara, on the course, and we started this company together. And we've been running this company for about 5 or 6 years now, and it's a lot of fun.
And I mean, it's one of those things where it's quite extraordinary. I think a lot of people talk about user experience design. That there's various jargons about sort of how you find a pain point or insights. But I think it's one of those things where, having seen your work, and we're going to get into that in a little bit later, but your insights into how psychology, magic, human behavior, all these sorts of things, it becomes sort of these little simple things that actually have a huge impact in your work. And so I was hoping that not just for sort of students who are at university, but actually I think there's even practitioners that have really been blown away by your approach. So it's not that I'm wanting to steal your secret sauce here, but I was wondering, could you maybe break down a little bit how is it you see things differently?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I have some slides that might help me explain. If you don't mind
Please
me
do. Yeah.
just sharing my screen a second. But I think it's interesting because it's lots of things. I'm a magician. I'm a member of the Magic Circle, and I'll kind of go into the magic in a second. But and that definitely has an influence on one sort of angle on the work that we do. But we're not a kind of magic studio. We don't design illusions for magicians. I've got friends who do that. It's an amazing kind of world. But we do design products that solve problems, albeit in a magical way. So magic's sort of one key ingredient, but it's part of a few things. And so if you can sort of see my screen now, I think the probably a really important thing in the way we think as a studio is that, as I mentioned, my background's in electronic engineering, and I spent a lot of time working on computer vision. But this was way back in like 2004, when you had like really bad kind of quality video. So it's quite a different kind of thing. And Clara's background is in product design and industrial design. So she's like a real industrial designer from Italy, so she really kind of gets it. And so we have this like massive kind of line down the middle between us of like, I'm very nerdy digital and she's very kind of, aesthetically sensitive physical. And so we think in two completely different ways. And, over time, like we start thinking together more and more, we kind of find this really interesting space in the middle. And every project, I mean, really, I think every project we do has some element of digital and physical. And I find the most interesting ones are the ones that are kind of really blur the lines between the two. And some of the ones I'll share later, hopefully do that. So that's really important in the way we think, and the move of moving, an experience going from digital to physical is very magical in its essence. It's sort of a transformation from one place to another. So there's some interesting kind of stuff just in that. The other thing is that both Clara and I studied human-centered design methodologies after we graduated, and these are just some like videos of user research that we do. And people sometimes talk about that as like, they kind of say, oh yeah, market research, and I don't think that really does it justice. Like every project we do always starts with a huge amount of time with people, not necessarily the people who will be using the product that we do, but people who are we're looking to inspire us. And so what this does is it makes the design process, much easier. And I could talk about this forever, but the more time you spend in front of people being exposed to unexpected things, the more you kind of increase the chances of seeing something new or something that you weren't thinking, then the easier the design process gets. It's like an amazing kind of pipe of inspiration, way better than kind of sitting kind of Googling at home. So we always involve people at the beginning of a project, even when the client hasn't asked for it, even when there's no budget for it. We'll still go out and do it and pretend we didn't. It's so important to what we do, and a third of our time is spent, on any project is spent with people. Then about a third of the time on kind of coming with ideas, and then the last third on essentially kind of communicating that idea, designing it, turning it into something that other people can interact with. So I'm kind of telling you this for a reason. It will make sense in a second. The last thing that you mentioned, this is Clara, by the way. And this was our Christmas card a few years ago, making a lemon appear. And we, as I mentioned, I'm a magician. I'm a trained sort of magician. I've been doing magic since I was 11 years old. And it's just such an important part of my personality. It's just in how I think. But over the years, as I got more and more involved in design, I started seeing a lot of parallels between the skill sets that magicians have when they create illusions and the skill sets that designers have when they try and create experiences, because we're both trying to create an experience. The amazing thing with magic is that you often have a secret thing. You were talking about the secret sauce. Like there's often a secret thing, whether it's, I'm not going to reveal anything, but people always think about sleeves and magnets and mirrors and all sorts of stuff. In reality, we really don't use them that often. But there's always some sort of secret technology or something behind the scenes making something work. But the magician has to create an experience for somebody that has nothing to do with how it actually works, because then it won't be magical. So you really have this constant, as a magician, when you're designing a magical experience, you're constantly moving from what's going on behind the curtain and what's going on in front of the curtain. And the important thing is to kind of keep those things really, really separate. If the method is good, the spectator will never see it, and it has no bearing on the effect they will have. The thing with design, especially when you're designing with technology, is that people get really obsessed with the technology, and a lot of the time they think, sorry, I'm going to just stop this video because I realize you're just seeing like a loop of of this lemon. This is probably quite mesmerizing. Can you?
I can see you again. Can you still carry on? No, okay, carry on.
Awesome. So I was just saying that in magic you have the method and you have the effect, and the effect has nothing to do with the method. And quite a lot of magicians, maybe bad magicians, get so hung up on how something's done, when really you just shouldn't care about that. You should do it in the most efficient way and then worry about the effect it's going to create, because that's where the magic happens in the spectator's mind. It doesn't happen in the method. And so as designers, and this is probably really quite specific to that kind of our world, but as designers we often start with some amazing technology. We're working with amazing companies that will show us really cool stuff, and there's a tendency to think that if something's technologically advanced enough, then it will be magical. And there's a really famous Arthur C. Clarke quote which you'll have heard a billion times, but any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I really think that that's not true in the context of design, because what that kind of implies is that if you have something that's really clever, really technologically kind of wow, then you're going to create a magical experience. It's much, much harder than that, because people don't care how it's done. They care about the way they experience it. And that's where the magic happens. It doesn't happen in the technology. It happens in the mind of the person who's perceiving it. So sorry, I'm maybe kind of going
Well,
like super into that specific point. But
I feel I almost want to just substantiate that in case there's any students who sort of are thinking that. But I guess just to give an example of where sometimes, and it, don't get me wrong, I love Google and I've done work with them, so this is not in any way slating it. But I think even they would have the sort of hindsight, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. It's 2020, but with Google Glasses, that was most certainly, should we say, magical quality technology, but the experience had a lot of small nuances which just didn't play out right in the user's head, as you said. So it didn't create a magical experience. And I think even though I would still stand by it and say Google Glass is far from dead as a thing, it's just it's very, very nascent and it hasn't fully got there. But I would love it if we can jump back into it, that it's so hard to get that marriage right. I really feel it is a pairing of complex things. So back to you, Adrian.
I mean, I think in a way, I kind of think, and this is, I think I have the answer, hopefully, a little bit in that thing. And I think Google Glass, and a lot of these sort of technologically wired products is that the problem is that they're sort of waiting for a problem to solve that doesn't necessarily exist. And so the reason kind of why I was talking about the involving the users, and I'm gonna magically flip back to my slides, is that if I just go here, is that and this is something that we've sort of slowly sort of discovered over time, is that we don't try and create magical things as a studio. We first need to find like a problem that needs solving, and we can only do that by spending time with people, observing, talking, and understanding something that needs fixing in the first place. So as a studio, we only use magic in a moment where it needs to be used. There's no point in making some product like magical just for the sake of it. I mean, you can't. That's kind of pure entertainment. But I've seen like really cheesy Bluetooth speakers, that levitate and do all these things. But there's no purpose to that at all. And in fact, it becomes unmagical very, very quickly. So what we're really interested in is using our time with people to find dips in a user experience, like some moment where the experience isn't working well, and then trying to fix that and act at precisely that moment and introduce the magic at exactly that moment to fix the problem. And so that's the thing for us. It's about when you actually have that magic happen. That's so important. The context is so important. And so it's really important to align those things. If you don't align them, then you just get a gimmick, really, and that will just be funny once, and that's it. Cool. So I think, hang on, I've lost my
I was waiting for the next slide. Forgive me.
Oh, that's it. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'll just show you a random slide. No, I mean, I don't know. I'm just going to stop sharing. So yeah, I think for us the magic is like tremendously interesting as a lens in creating and structuring and like orchestrating like an experience. But for us, we're only interested in doing it if it has a function, if it actually is solving a problem. And quite often magic is delightful. It can be surprising. There are lots of like inherent, it can bring people back to a sort of childhood state of wonder, which you hear about quite a lot. Hopefully some of the projects I'll show you, I think all of them are magical in some way, but they're actually all quite functional. They're all trying to solve a problem. And I think, that's, I guess, what we're trying to do as designers is, create kind of practical magic.
So I wonder, before we jump into it, I almost feel like one of the things, because your work is probably so unfamiliar to a lot of textbook design courses, and your approach is quite, should we say, you've internalized it and it's become part of you. So I'm not saying you don't know how to explain what you do, but I'm saying that it might be helpful almost to give people a bit of a framing to almost know how to interpret your work, because it feels like can we do a sort of quick 101 on what are some of the basic tools that a magician uses, because then I think people will have the right goggles, as it were, to view your work and go, I see what you did there. So could you give us a little bit of a framing, as it were, to what to look for in special projects experiences?
I mean, I think probably the best is if I just show you the projects, because it's hard to we try really hard to kind of create sort of rules and frameworks for these things to help communicate them. But I think probably the best way is to just show you sort of
Yeah.
why we did what we did, and then maybe sort of pick up on
Let's
bits.
do that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to just share my screen again. So yeah, this first project is like a really old project for us. It's actually pretty much 10 years old now. So you have to kind of cast your mind back to the technology we had 10 years ago, like the phones we had and these sorts of things. And this was a project for Samsung. And they asked us at the time to create a phone for old people. That was the brief. And that was quite a challenging brief and quite a scary brief because we were quite new to all of this, and making a new phone is really quite a terrifying, daunting kind of thing, especially because there are so many phones that already exist. And so we were able to work with them to reframe the brief a little bit, to change the wording, to make it all about enabling older adults to use and enjoy mobile technology. So, because the brief itself was really kind of narrowing it down to designing a phone. So I'm not going to spend ages in the research, but if there's anything you want me to sort of like talk about more, I'm really happy to. But I just wanted to kind of just give you a bit of framing for the project.
Yeah.
So when we started the project, there were a lot of products out there for older people, but a lot of them were designed with this image in mind. Like they imagined that when you're old, it's all about getting products that are beige and grey, and you living in poverty and misery, and just old is just not fun, right? And a lot of kind of assisted living products at the time were really designed with this image in mind. So we kind of printed out this like very cheesy kind of Getty image and stuck it up on the studio wall. And we kind of thought we really want to be inspired by, like, be optimistic about aging and kind of try and spend our time with people to understand all the things they can do, and focus on people's abilities rather than getting bogged down by their disabilities. And at the time, if you went into a phone shop and you asked to buy a phone for your grandmother or mother or anyone, these are the sorts of phones they would suggest you buy. And these are really stigmatizing things. If I gave this to my mum, she'd get really angry and she really would get very angry with me, and she would feel old,
Yeah.
and it's quite stigmatizing. And why can't she use the same phone as everyone else? So it was an interesting kind of landscape. And this is probably the most like useful tool in a way that we use, and it's certainly not ours. It's quite a common design tool. But when you're a lot of the briefs we get are very, very open. Like, we're kind of, people only usually gonna come to us when they have no idea what they're looking for, and that's the best brief for us. But as a result, it means we don't know where to start. I mean, there's so many places you could begin. And so what we always do is, we kind of try and squish the whole user journey down into like a long line. Sometimes it gets way more complex than this. But, we know we're talking about phones and older adults. So we kind of thought, well, what are all the stages you go through in kind of interacting with a phone? What's the experience? So we went all the way right back to the beginning. When you decide you need a phone, you might get given one. How do you even know you need a phone? Why do you want a particular one? How do you get that? Does someone give it to you? Like, a lot of people give their old phones to their parents. Do you buy it yourself? What's that buying experience? Then when you get it, like, how do you open it? How do you start learning how to use it? How do you actually use it? Like, do you talk to it? What happens? Do you then recommend it? Do you then buy it again? So we kind of like, we flattened it all out. And then we were like detectives, just going into every one of these phases and exploring and trying to kind of see if we could get inspiration from each of them. And we did a lot of research for this. We visited a lot of people in their homes. And again, like, I'm really happy to go into more detail about sort of specifically what we did there. But it's really important to us to see the context, rather than just talking to someone like we're doing now. It's much, much better if you can kind of get into their homes or into the place where they'll be interacting with the product you might be inventing.
Do you think it'd be really nice also if you could break it down a little bit, and that I think often, when you start off in your career, it's quite intimidating, the prospect to think, oh my gosh, maybe I'll just email them and I'll get my user research with a questionnaire. That sounds like a good idea, right? And then I'll get some nice graphs at the end of it. But you obviously go at it a much more visceral approach, and it requires a lot more sort of emotional sensitivity to the situation. But I'm sure you're having to like read a lot more just about the person, but also their environment and the context and their tonality and how they express themselves. So I was wondering, could you sort of walk us through a little bit how you approach someone with that sensitivity and awareness for insights?
Yeah, I think the important thing for us is, let me just see if I stop sharing my screen. We so we'll never use research agencies to kind of find people to interview. We've never done that. We only had to do that once because it was like for a pharmaceutical company, and there were all these legal kind of things we had to watch out for. But we'll always go through someone we know. It's really important for us to be able to build rapport with someone, often quite quickly. You're only going to spend, maybe 2-3 hours together sometimes. And if you're going into someone's home, and it might be someone vulnerable for various reasons, it's quite an intimidating experience for people. So if we have one person in common, or we kind of been introduced through someone, we're okay. Someone can vouch for us, and we immediately break down a lot of barriers that would take a bit of time to break down. So for us, we don't mind if we have some connection to the person we're interviewing. Some people kind of think that introduces bias, and it does. Jude, I'm going to just have to really quickly get this call, if that's okay.
Yeah. Thanks for coming back again.
Cool.
So
yeah,
carry on, please.
So we were just talking about how we often try and have like a bit of a connection with the people we're talking to, because it's really important we have rapport, and we want them to just be really honest with us, and not to feel like an intimidating kind of market research kind of session. We really kind of try and connect, and we do a lot of things to make that process feel really joyful and delightful for them. We really design the research itself, so we'll often make really bespoke kind of tools or experiences for them, and I think they really respond well, because they see that we've put a lot of effort into this, and we're really valuing what they're telling us. At the same time, we're trying to make it easier for them to express themselves, maybe about unfamiliar things. So in this particular project, we were talking about technology in the sort of older age group, and so it was we had some problems at the beginning because they didn't always have the sort of right vocabulary to express what they wanted. So I'll show a couple of the ways we got around that. Just really, another thing that's really important to us is that this stuff is really easy, and in fact, usually the bigger a company you're in, the harder it is to do, because you need to sign so many forms and stuff to go out and speak to people. You just call people up and go and speak to them. Really, just that's how you get started. You don't even need to have like an amazing, perfect, beautiful structure when you begin. And if anything, just take notes. We always take notes on paper. And when you're talking to people, you're already beginning to think about concepts and little ideas, whether you know it or not. The other thing is we try and we keep it usually to about six or eight people, usually in a project. It's not that many. But we'll make sure that those people are really different. It's really important to us. And in design jargon, it's like called extreme users. But we're trying to, like I mentioned before, we're trying to increase the chances of us witnessing something that we didn't expect. That's why we're doing the research, and we're not doing it to make a report or fill in a beautiful graph. We're doing it as designers to just feed us with inspiration. We're just looking for little things that might set us off on an unexpected path. So it's really important to have people who are quite different. So in this project, at the beginning, we actually spoke to an 11-year-old, even though we were designing phones for a completely different age group, just to kind of shift us and kind of understand, a kind of almost opposite of what we were looking for. So in this project, and I'll quickly flip back, but we spoke to people who lived alone, but we also spoke to people who lived in couples. And we also spoke to people who lived in groups as well. And so that was really important, because they had like really, really different perspectives on how they might want to socialize. And a phone is such a kind of important part of how you socialize. We then, and I'll quickly just show this if it's interesting, we then had to do some like workshops, because we did some research in Italy and Norway and in the UK. And again, we picked these quite different places to get unexpected insights. And so we found, especially in Italy and Norway, we only had a day with 6 people, so it was really kind of quick, and we had to kind of get through a lot of material. And so we actually ended up creating this like research tool, which was a banana. And the reason, you see there's a guy drawing on a banana there. And what we did is we told people, if this banana was your dream phone, tell us what it can do. And the reason why we did this is at the beginning, we were kind of going to the workshops with we would draw a box on a bit of paper, and we would say, this is a phone, fill in the gaps, tell us what it does. And people would just end up drawing the phones like the ones I showed you at the beginning, kind of, they just draw big buttons and a big screen and they say, right, that's what I want. And it was really like skewing the research. And so what we thought is we really wanted people just to be very aspirational. You know, it's our job as designers. We're not asking them to design the phone. It's our job as designers to sort of interpret that and then design it. We were looking to kind of really get on a very basic level what their kind of basic aspirations were for a phone. And by making it so ridiculous to, you know, involving bananas, it meant that they didn't take themselves too seriously and they were able to kind of let go a bit. And so we said, if this is your dream phone, what can it do? And it was really interesting, like the things that they asked for on their dream phones weren't as tall as far-fetched as we were expecting. And in fact, all the things they asked for in their dream phone already existed on smartphones that you could buy at the time. So, for example, this one had, in Italy, they'd written, I want everything to be vocal on my phone. I want to be able to talk to my phone. But that already exists. You can do that now, and you could do it back then. There's a little button at the back with film. So I want to watch films on my phone. You can do that too. This one had a button to make the kids happy. So this gentleman would look after his grandkids. They'd be really noisy sometimes. So he wanted to push a button on his phone and the kids would just kind of like, they would actually go to sleep, but he kind of wrote happy because it sounded a bit better. But it took us a while to figure it out, but that's what people do with tablets, you know, all the time. If you've got noisy kids, you can stick a phone in front of them and they'll go quiet. So all of the things they were asking for in their dream phone already existed. And so we had a lot of insights then. And I guess what we were, so sorry, I'll quickly show you one of the things, like what we kind of came away from this research with was a kind of overarching insight, which was that the things that people wanted in their phones already existed in phones that you could buy that at that time. So we didn't need to design a phone. There was no need to design a phone, but something was stopping them from being able to use those phones. You know, why otherwise they would have them in their hands. So we did a little bit more research and we found that at exactly this moment when they kind of bought a new phone and took it out of the box, this is where something was going really, really wrong. So if you look at the bottom, there's Duncan, who was in his mid-20s at the time. And we gave him a new phone and we said, send us a message. And he immediately kind of pulls it out and able to figure it out. And Beverly, who was in her mid-60s at the time, the first thing she does, and you can see in that video, when she opens the box, is she starts to read the manual. And she starts to read like every single page of it. And she just was approaching it in a completely different way to Duncan. And she was looking for help in the box, but there was no help in that box. And so bringing it back and just sort of bringing it right back to that sort of user journey, what we found is that the sort of user experience was pretty good up until the point you opened the box. And then there was this like massive dip. It just was suddenly like really complicated. You had this terrible manual and you suddenly get lost and frustrated. And as a result, it meant that people were not learning how to use their phones and they weren't able to kind of make good use of them after and kind of do all the things they can do. So we were able to go back to our client at the time and kind of say, look, like we want to act precisely there at the unboxing. So, you know, through all this kind of journey, we were able to kind of hone in on this one moment. And then what we did, and I'll kind of go, I'll just sort of jump straight to what we ended up creating, with tons of prototypes, all different sorts of ideas, but we basically worked with the existing dimensions of the packaging for a Samsung phone at the time, but we turned the packaging into a set of books, because books are a really familiar mental model. You kind of know and expect how they work. But when you open this book, the first thing you see is the SIM card. So kind of a bit of a surprise. You see the SIM card in there. And then when you turn the page, you see where it goes inside the phone. So the phone's sort of suspended in the pages of the book, and we're revealing step by step the things that you need to see at the right moment. And if you can remember what it was like 10 years ago, you used to have to take your phone apart, you know, just when you bought it, just to kind of use it. And if you're not familiar with technology, that can be a really intimidating process, and you maybe never even touched a SIM card before. And that's what we found in the research. What was interesting as well is that when we were doing that research, people were getting so upset at this unboxing phase. But when we did this sort of intervention, people actually, you know, were giggling, you know, as they were doing it, and they were able to kind of complete the task, you know, really efficiently. And the other book is the main manual, and we kept looking at videos, you know, of people learning, and they're often looking at a book and the phone here and going back and forth. It's really inefficient process. So what we did is we put the phone right in the middle of the manual, in a sort of cutout compartment, and then all the instructions point around. So you put all the attention in one space. So, I mean, I've talked about this on Project for ages, but it's kind of like taking a familiar mental model, a familiar experience, which is a book, and kind of just twisting that in a kind of quite delightful and very slightly magical way, but in a very functional way too. All of these kind of interventions have a purpose. Their goal is to get you using your phone so you can kind of enjoy and kind of connect with other people. So that's I don't know. I don't know if you have any questions, or I can ramble about this one forever.
No,
but
I mean,
this is kind of maybe sorry.
No. I think one of the phrases that sort of without overly straining the word magic all the time to broaden our vocabulary, I've always been a fan of the phrase "a smile in the mind," and I feel like your work is very much like that. It's not necessarily always eliciting like gasps of awe, but I can imagine someone just looking at that thinking, "This is genuinely joyful to interact with." It's hard not to be charmed by that. And how often can you say unboxing is charming as well as,
Well,
painless?
It's interesting you say that, because I mean, often, because we're usually taking a quite familiar experience and trying to elevate it to an unexpected, surprising level, and it's obviously easier to create a bigger surprise if you start off with very low expectations about an experience. Yes. If you go and see if you go into Harry Potter World, you're already expecting it to be amazing. So you're sort of starting here. So they have to work really hard to give you that magic differential, right? Whereas if you're starting with like a user manual, I mean, like, those things are never very interesting. And in fact, we kind of often joke in the studio, because a lot of our projects are things like, weighing scales, user manuals. Like they're quite boring sounding things when you kind of hear about them on the surface. But I think it's much, much easier to make something more, unexpected and impressive. I think you mentioned one thing, Jude. I just wanted to share one slide, but like, about kind of a sort of level of astonishment. And I think we kind of drew this a while ago where we were kind of trying to explain what we do. And, if you imagine a scale of astonishment, you've got something that gives you, on a lower end, you've got something that just gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling, like something's just kind of like, very kind of emotional reaction to something. And then all the way through to kind of more magical things like delight, surprise, wonder, and awe. And, most magicians try and be at the top end, and they want to create miracles, right? And really make you gasp, as you mentioned. Whereas for us, that's not sort of what we're trying to do. We're trying to give you that kind of small, like, emotional resonance with an experience that will then enable you to kind of overcome some problem that we're trying to solve. So if we give people a warm, fuzzy feeling, just a slight kind of tingle, then that's perfect. That's exactly what we're kind of hoping to do.
Well, I dare say it, and almost just if you leave the slide there for a second, it's almost interesting. Okay, It's interesting to contemplate almost where you have legitimacy to evoke a certain emotion. I mean, you don't want your doctor to elicit awe. you want, or surprise, indeed. You want it to be quite grounded and authoritative and reassuring, maybe with some charm, maybe with some humor. But it's interesting how, I mean, I'm just being sympathetic to your earlier point when I asked the question of decoding, but I think I can fully appreciate that this is always case specific. What emotions you're, if it were colors on a canvas, you have to pick your colors quite carefully. It's not about trying to use the rainbow on every single painting. And I think Special Projects is very adept about having the self-awareness to know where it is. But I guess referring to this slide, it's interesting that surprise and delight was definitely a sort of a buzzwordy phrase in marketing. And so it's interesting to sort of see how I would almost want to overlay this diagram of where do other departments within a company think that what emotions are they playing with in their toolkit. And I think you do that very well in that you often sort of integrate these things into huge companies like Samsung to help them also understand how to use your work. So I guess my question is, once you've done your amazing design presentation, usually you're presenting to people who are hungry for what you've delivered. But we all know the innovator's dilemma, as it were, is it's a tough journey for them to then sell it back into the company. So how do you, should we say, better equip them so that the fact that you're producing something that isn't the status quo, that isn't a tiny little improvement, how do you help companies take that leap internally, so that ultimately it reaches the customer?
I mean, I think a lot of it is, storytelling. And in fact, I kind of mentioned, so I'll just stop sharing the screen. I think I kind of mentioned that, we spend about a third of our time doing the sort of research with people, about a third of our time coming up with those concepts. But then the last third is the sort of communication. And that might be prototyping something, that might be sort of designing it. We kind of think of design as like that whole journey, but really, that communication is taking that concept and finding a vehicle for someone else to experience it, which might be actually making it or whatever. So about, really the last third of our time is spent on storytelling, really. And it's so important for us to be able to, especially in companies, to be able to take people on that journey. And that's why we really try hard to document that whole research process and really tell a story before we kind of reveal the trick. And if one of my favorite magicians, Darren Brown, if you go and see one of his sort of live shows, probably only about 15% of the show is actual magic happening. Like the rest is him sort of setting things up in a way, and that's so important. That's what kind of elevates it to another level. So, if you were to just see that video of which I just showed of the book at the end without any kind of context, you would maybe not appreciate some of the sort of decisions we've made if you hadn't kind of understood what problem we were trying to solve. So we always try and anchor that magic or that solution, that design solution, in a problem and kind of locate it on the timeline of where we're trying to sort of solve that problem before kind of revealing it. So things like videos are super powerful. We make videos all the time. One of the rooms in our studio is just like a permanently set up kind of like little mini studio for recording things. And that's because, experiences are time-based. It's really hard. I mean, imagine just with magic tricks, like if I was only able to show you a magic trick in one photo and that be magical to you, that'd be really difficult. I mean, that's really hard. I'd only be able to show you like optical illusions and kind of puzzles like that. Magic is very often a time-based experience. So just like design, like you need to kind of deliver it in that similar way. And I often joke with my magician friends is that a lot of our videos kind of look like magic trick videos, even though sometimes, they're not magic tricks that we create, but we try and kind of set it up in a certain way. So yeah, I think being able to kind of storytelling, being able to take people on that journey, on the research, on that thought process is a really, really important part to kind of frame the problem that you're trying to solve. And then, we'll often, almost always show the final concept, the experience as a sort of time-based kind of performance, whether it's in a video or in real time. And we'll often, quite often if it's for like larger companies, we'll maybe be inventing something. We'll be inventing something that doesn't exist. So maybe it takes a while to make this, but they want to know if it's worth making. So we have to kind of validate it in some way. So, quite often we'll fake it in some way. And that's just so much fun because we'll have to kind of bring people in and, pretend with them that this thing exists. And, we've had people under the table pulling, strings and stuff like this. We do that all the time. And we kind of try and bring that experience to life as much as possible and make that as theatrical as possible so that people can kind of understand what it will potentially feel like to experience that. And, that's prototyping and, it's not a sort of new thing. But I do think we kind of try and use some of those magicians' sort of storytelling skill sets to bring an inanimate object to life in some ways when it can't kind of work yet.
So it's interesting that you mentioned a little bit about the prototyping, and I guess you're referring to what is sometimes called Wizard of Oz or Faker-type and things like this, just for anyone new to this discipline.
Sure.
But it's interesting, I really love the example of the banana because quite often people think it has to be all about very, very good 3D prints with nice coats of paint and lacquer. And I think you made a really astute point of saying, actually, if you go in and use humor and make it a little bit quirky and a bit similar, a bit silly, then people actually drop their guard and are more likely to open up. I could reference, Lego has a thing called serious play, which gets people to build things out of bricks, and then articulate on top of it what it means to them. And of course, the bricks are irrelevant. It's what people are then pushed into a nice, comfortable space to feel that they can open up. I mean, it's almost, I mean, I think it probably is using sort of psychologist techniques to get people to go layers deeper than they would just in normal conversation.
Yeah.
So I guess to sort of bring it back a little bit, I was curious to know if you could sort of tell us a little bit about, obviously you've come from a sort of electronics background, but for me, I've often sort of, forgive anyone listening if I'm rattling out the same story, but I know when at Dyson, we went through this interesting transition of being very mechanically orientated with our prototypes, and then increasingly adopting things like Arduino and Raspberry Pi to get more electromechanical. And of course, you alluded to that you worked with sort of Google, and although I'm not going to ask for anything confidential, I'm sure you must be playing with things that are of that ilk. And so you're entering into a vanguard of how do you prototype with things like machine learning, with AI, you know, where is that taking you, without giving any examples, just to keep it open? How do you feel you play an experiment with technology so ultimately people get it?
It's interesting. Like, I'd say it's almost become a bit easier to prototype now because so many of these like methods are invisible and so far away running on a server that you know, I think it's harder to prototype like the experience of like 100-meter like 3D holographic wall than it is to prototype a voice assistant, right? or these sorts of things. So in some ways, I don't think, you know, the stimulus maybe is changing all the time with technology, but the way we receive it hasn't changed for millennia, right? We're still humans, and you know, there's that amazing the amazing diagram I think Tom Igoe did of how we perceive the world as humans. It's kind of like we've seen with a finger and an eye. I'll dig it out.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the bottom
image
for sure. Yeah,
it's beautiful because it kind of just shows, you know, the way we perceive the world, and you know, the way we perceive the world hasn't you know really changed that much. So I think I don't know. I don't know if it's things. I mean, I think maybe 10 years ago we were spending a lot more time kind of soldering and really like making kind of things. That whole world just got a lot easier over time and it just became more accessible. But I think, you know, a lot of the time we're telling a story and you know, we sometimes get people just to imagine, you know, really imagine things, you know, just without even putting anything in front of them. I don't know, like if you imagine, you know, in theatre, you know, you can get away with a lot. You know, you can create incredible worlds with very little material on stage. You know, it's an incredible skill that they have in theatre. And I think likewise with prototyping and experience, like you don't necessarily need to physically build or show someone exactly what you're trying to create for them to give you the experience that you're kind of trying to validate. I couldn't really tell you what we did. Sorry. I wish I could share.
No, it's always difficult. I guess maybe to flip a different question then that I had just thinking about what you were saying. I forgive me for always just being contrary, but it's just sometimes nice to play that game of you're almost being a bit like Walt Disney in his phrase of like plussing things, or trying to sort of, as you said, invert that curve from a pain point to being something that's better. Is there anything that you've gone through where you actually feel the opposite? And the only reason I could think that might be not a completely ridiculous question is because your point you mentioned about the delta between, you know, a low point and a high point. If you realized actually this is we've done a great thing, but it feels like nothing. So we actually need to create a little bit of a sort of a dip to then make that feel special again. I mean, if it was a horror movie, you'd say that there's build up before the release of tension, but have you ever felt you've engineered some deliberate pain point to then win big?
So like almost sabotaging an experience in order to like save it or like retrofit. I
mean, it's quite weird what I'm asking.
It's so weird because like you know, like I don't know where. I think the hardest thing for us as a studio is, you know, once you kind of say you do magic, it kind of pigeonholes you in a certain way and people kind of think about gimmicky kind of things and you know, they want you to create, we want more magic, you know, people are addicted to magic, whereas we're quite often trying to cut it down and remove it as much as possible. And like one of our you know, values is clarity, and that's just as important, you know, as magic. And in fact, you know, any good magician hones things down and cuts them right down to create the kind of purest effect. You have think, as you're kind of experiencing something, you have to be absolutely as clear as possible for people to perceive that something, magical has happened. So a lot of the time we're trimming things away. And I think Clara is amazing at that, at kind of, and I think that's why we work really well together, is that, just kind of honing in on really like what the central kind of, some people often think our design is quite minimal, and maybe I can show some other stuff, because we often really try and boil it down to like the purest kind of like moment. So I don't think we would ever introduce something that might clutter that experience in order to give you a high later. I think that would be really, I can't think of an example where we maybe have done that. But it's a really good question. I just can't think of something where we've maybe,
I guess I know. I guess I'm referring
I'll tell you what. Actually,
bit.
I can. Oh yeah, sorry.
I guess what came to mind, if it's helpful to sort of see where it goes, is maybe a less crazy question. Is really, I know with IDO, when I was in some of the workshops that they were running, they were saying sometimes deliberately creating the anti-experience can actually help you understand the positive experience better.
Oh, okay, as part of your process, not as part
I'm not,
of the final
I'm not saying
experience.
that has to be the final experience, but I guess another example where I think that has been in effect is that I remember speaking to a coder who was saying, interestingly, when you look at banks, that little bit where it says we're sending your money to the account, that happens in like a millisecond. But that little bar that goes across the screen, that is just BS, it's nonsense, but it gives you the sense of something important must be happening, so you almost feel assured that the progress bar is thinking hard. But it's all smoke and mirrors, excuse the pun, but it's interesting how that is friction added because the user needs the friction. And so I guess that was an example that I was aware of.
I think, no, it's actually a really good question. And I think like one of the projects I wanted to share, I think there's maybe something kind of maybe interesting in that. And it's
this is good choice. Good choice.
So this was a really, really fun sort of project where we've been working on sort of more secretly with some companies on themes around digital well-being, and there's a lot of talk now about people spending too much time on their phones, doing, using Instagram, whatever they're doing, on their phones, and sort of being disconnected from the real world. And we've actually worked on some, probably about 10 or so different inventions around that sort of secretly, which were it's quite a serious sort of topic. I mean, it can cause a lot of bother for some people. And then we kind of came up with these various ideas. We had bits left over from some other projects, little things that were bubbling around in the studio, and we came up with this concept, which this is purposely quite a provocative experiment. So this is by no means a sort of solution that's going to solve the problem. It's more like design studio playing with ideas. And kind of seeing where we got to. So you can't kind of judge it as a finished product. But
would it be fair to say it's a thought piece, if that helps people?
Yeah, it's totally a thought piece. Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting. And so we kind of imagined a scenario where you maybe think you spend too much time on your phone, and I'm just holding a prop here. Spend too much time on your phone, and maybe at the weekend you don't want to use your phone. You want to focus on like your family, your friends, whatever, just not be distracted by your phone. So there's loads of amazing solutions to this already. Some people use an old like Nokia phone, like just to kind of have something that doesn't have social media on it, and leave their phone, locked in a drawer. There's loads of workarounds that people do, and we wanted to create this really like quite accessible sort of experiment that people could just try out. So we made this envelope that looks like an old phone dialer, and you basically and we made an app as well, and you basically put your phone into that envelope and seal it, and you kind of like lick the back and seal it, and from that point on your smartphone has now become like an old kind of dumb phone while it's in that device. And I think I just have to hop to a video to show you what I mean. So basically, once that kind of envelope is on, you can only dial numbers on that phone and kind of make a call. And there's some really, really nice, like this was really fun to work on, because you've got the screen kind of that still shines through the paper, and the sort of capacitive sensing of the phone screen still works through the paper, so it can still kind of register your finger presses. But what was really nice with this is that once we had this idea, we started playing with it, and we started thinking about adding features to it. And we realized that, we're trying to remove all the features, but now we're trying to add features back in. And we were, on this very kind of like dangerous tightrope where we might mess up the whole concept by putting too many features back in. And so what we had to decide was early on is that we're only going to allow things to happen within kind of printed circles, because we want people to believe that they're buttons, and we want people to believe that their phone has sort of been transformed into something else. So we never kind of shine information or data out of those buttons. Like we kind of, and that's a completely like self-induced, self-imposed constraint. But it's important because we don't want to break that illusion that their phone is now, what is printed on there. So we did add a couple of features which I really like. So we had speed dial. So you're allowed one speed dial, because you had that on old phones. And then you've got a clock, because people do use that. So you push that. But again, we shine the time on the little buttons. So again, I think what's really nice with that is that we, originally we could have written the time at the top, right? But it would have completely broken that illusion. So I guess by introducing those limitations, it kind of helped corroborate that sort of illusion that we were trying to create. I'll just show you the other way you can use this. We made two envelopes. And one is for a camera. And so with this, you can only take photos or videos, but you can't even see them until the end of the day or when you stop.
Because once upon a time it was like that.
Yeah, it's exactly back to kind of 35 mil. But yeah, this was like a really interesting project. And again, like to the point about kind of clarity, we really tried hard to kind of boil this down to like its essence. And it doesn't really get more sort of minimal, than this. And that's why we kind of made the design, it's just so kind of clear, so people kind of understand this as much as possible. So yeah, that was called Envelope, that one. And we did quite a few other projects around that kind of field.
But I think maybe just to sort of, without getting too meta about this, could you break it down, the commercial importance, not just maybe for students, but also for companies? Why is it sometimes to do something which on the surface, and this isn't with respect to your project, but having done similar things at Dyson and Lego, I know I have my take on it, but sometimes you have to do something that is obtuse, avant, borderline pretentious, because sometimes it just unseats people's thinking to such an extreme that then actually the what was radical now looks actually almost normalized because this thing is so extreme. So I was wondering, how have you legitimized that technique that you've just shown? Because obviously Google's a kind of a big deal, and they're taking that seriously as being a helpful thing, and they were very pleased.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because like a third of our work is for quite large companies, like usually tech companies, but not always. And with those sorts of projects, we're often, the finished product that we design isn't necessarily the thing of value. It's kind of showing them a new kind of, almost like strategically, like a new path to take, or just looking at something from a different angle. And they have amazing resources internally to then redesign it 100 times over, and manufacture and everything. So we're really kind of adding value and kind of showing them a new sort of path to take. So in those contexts, I think, the clarity, is so important, because really I see the concept, like the final kind of concept, really as a metaphor for the insight, as a way of making that insight easier to digest and understand and kind of visualize. Because, you could kind of deliver, you could kind of say, hey, this is our main insight. Oh, great muting. I saw you cough, just that's incredible skills. Wow, that's amazing. Sorry. Yeah.
Carry on.
I think the important thing is that with larger companies, I often think that the sort of final designed product is often a sort of easier way to digest the insights and communicate it in a more kind of efficient way by bringing an insight to life that then can go on and take many other forms. When we work with startups, though, it's a different story because, really we have to deliver something that needs to be built and made very quickly, and they depend on it. They don't necessarily have as much time and budget as larger companies to just sort of explore things. So it's a different kind of story. But I think, with those larger companies, we can often afford to dream a bit, and they want us to take them out of their comfort zone. And the only reason they're coming to an external company is they've maybe come up against a brick wall internally, or for various reasons, they can't quite think in a different way for political reasons, or just from habit of doing things in a certain way. So, I really kind of see our job is to kind of lead them to some new unexpected land. And that's why we call it sort of special projects. We want to create a special project. We're not like kind of just doing sort of, boring or kind of expected projects in a way. Yeah.
I guess it's been interesting to sort of look at this. And you mentioned earlier sort of about finance, but as being a sort of difficult thing to reconcile sometimes, and I guess how, if I could get into it a little bit, and I appreciate you can't be client specific, but I'm just trying to think of students who are thinking, wow, I would love to do what you do. Now, of course, you're incredibly inspirational and that's great, but when you're starting off with no pedigree, you haven't done a lot of projects for clients before, that's quite hard to suddenly just overnight become the equivalent of special project in another place with very little experience. So I wondered sort of, are there any ways that you feel people could quite literally bootstrap themselves into a place of being taken seriously? Is it a case of just putting crazy ideas out there, or is there a bit more to it?
I mean, I think you kind of nailed it. I think it's very easy now to make kind of concept videos and kind of put ideas out there and kind of aim them at the kind of big sort of design or tech blogs. And certainly I kind of mentioned that, about a third of our work is with like larger companies, a third is with startups, but the final third is our own inventions that we're trying to kind of, license or kind of, grow in some way. And with those ones, we're often, sort of starting at zero. Like we have maybe some good contacts that might help us get them sort of into nice blogs by kind of putting them in front of people. But in general, it's sort of just, we're just sort of emailing people and trying to see what happens. So I would say, if you don't have the clients yet, you can, certainly dream, you can dream up a project for free, set yourself a brief that might be, in line with the sort of companies you're trying to work with, and create a kind of fictional project around that theme or around what those companies are doing, and really just trying to hone your skills at communicating these ideas. I mean, there are lots of sort of steps along you might not want to do the whole thing. You might want to just look at research, or you might want to just look at kind of bringing concepts to life. But I think it is still, it's never been easier to kind of make films and kind of digital kind of designs and kind of put them out there. I just think you have to just start kind of, really just kind of putting your ideas out there. That's what we've done all the time with our sort of some of our own kind of patented inventions and things that we're trying to promote. Sorry, it's not a really inspiring kind of answer. I'm just sort of saying, just get started, just do something and put it out there. And even just making a film or a photo tells so much about your eye and your attention to detail. Even just photographing a project that already exists, or telling, or just taking something like getting on the bus. And I mean, God, with coronavirus now, I mean, there are so many opportunities to rethink so many things. But, you could just say, what will getting on the bus look like if this happened? Or, and you could try and tell that story. There's so many disciplines involved in kind of communicating what that might look like. So I think, essentially a self-initiated project around a theme that other people are going to be interested in.
And I mean, maybe just to sort of underscore what I think is obvious to you, but just for clarity for anyone watching this, that I think, would it be fair to say that special projects, you're not really hired for your ability to use scalpels and 3D print prototypes. You're hired for the quality of your thinking and your process. And so in many ways, you could say that's actually quite decoupled from a workshop or from a studio. It's really what exists in your and Clara's and the wider associates that you work with. And so I wonder whether that's a sort of a helpful message, just to point out to some people at the beginnings of their career that it's not about saying, oh well, I can't do anything that's really, really thought provoking unless I have all the tools. I mean, the you know, the classic sort of quip of all the gear and no idea for sort of students who buy all the, you know, fine art sketching tools but can't actually just knock out a good still life drawing with a biro and a sheet of printer paper. I kind of feel like you guys would be incredible even if you have very little resources, and indeed you said it yourself, you impose constraints on yourself even when there's no need to. So I guess one of the other things to maybe flip it round, that's looking from the perspective of how do individuals outside of companies create things interestingly as a sort of satellite experience. What's been your observations of people? They're sometimes called intrapreneurs, or you know, within accelerators or startups inside companies. What's been your experience of how people take the best of what you've been talking about of experience design, but also frame it inside a brand which has a legacy? I mean, this isn't just to say about Lego or Dyson, but often, you know, they're you can do magical things like this, but you have to frame it within the context of the brand so it sort of makes sense, even if it's provocative. Is that a clear question?
Yeah, it is. I'm just trying to think of a good example. I mean, quite often, like larger companies that have that heritage and kind of that sort of baggage in a way, I mean, I would say like 9 times out of 10, they kind of specifically don't want to give us any material, or you would think, you know, if you're working for like some company, they would say, okay, these are the brand values, this is our mission, you know, all of this, and kind of make sure. Like that never happens. I mean, that's really never happened to us. And we've worked with quite a lot of really big companies. I think maybe it's just to do with the fact that we are sort of brought in to take people to a new place. I think they want to make sure that we're not, you know, we're not gonna. They don't want to impose too many constraints on us at all. And I think if anything, they're sort of seeing that they're the constraints that they have pushed on them. So if they could kind of avoid us giving us that burden, then they would. I mean, it's not to say that we don't. You know, for example, with any project we do, once we sort of come up with the, you know, well, even before we come up with the idea, we'll do a lot of work researching not just that company, but you know, parallel kind of brands and products. And we will, you know, there will be a voice, you know, a personality, a theme to that experience that's really clearly defined. You know, the one I just showed you now with the envelope is like, you know, so kind of minimal. I mean, the whole point is, you know, you print it out, you do it yourself, it's free. There's no branding on it. It's very minimal. But like for example, the Samsung one before was a kind of, you know, cloth bound book to give you that sort of warmth and kind of understand that time has been taken to create something. Someone's spent the time to understand that you need your time to learn this product, and there's a lot of care that's gone into every page, and that's reflected through the font and the colors and so many things. So you know, we will often echo something from that brand, but we're not, you know, I think people come to us really for that sort of new or the next thing. So we're often given sort of free rein in a way to kind of take that brand to another place. But it will always sort of make sense. But yeah, often we're trying to create usually quite a big step away from where they are now.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's really insightful, and dare say it quite emboldening for anyone at the beginning of their company to think, oh right, so actually there is no big Dropbox folder of information that I'm lacking to go create something for a company that I love. If you really just want to go off and do something nuts in the weekend and secretly target it, you know, you want 2 or 3 of these companies to pick it up, there is no shame in going on LinkedIn and being like, hey, I made this thing, hope you like it, to a couple of people
Absolutely.
who might be design managers or whatever. And I'm sure you got that hustle from day one, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think, and it's all about the sort of storytelling and learning and honing those skills, and like, how are you going to communicate this thing efficiently, in like 3 pictures or a small video or whatever. Like they're the things that I would be sort of practicing and learning all the time.
So I guess one of the things, maybe to sort of a slightly closing question, but feel free to add on any other things that you wanted to mention. But I guess sometimes I speak to people who are absolutely exceptional in their field, and that's great. But you've always struck me as someone who sort of takes very, very broad exposure of all sorts of things. To sort of quote the Welcome collection, you seem almost a bit like incurably curious, at times. You go everywhere and anywhere. So I wondered, could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the references which maybe aren't typical design or even indeed typical magic, that have really, I don't want to use the word blown your mind, but really just changed your whole outlook on something?
Okay. Okay. I'm just thinking. It's interesting. I mean, and like this, we're 6 people in the studio, so it's just to say that everyone brings so much. Everyone is so different, and that brings so much to the table, and so many other different perspectives. I'd love to ask everyone in the studio what they think as well, but I mean, okay. Let me think. Sorry, I need a second. Just
It's quite
think.
all right.
It's so difficult. So I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I do have some pretty obscure magic references, but I mean, so Darren Brown has a really good book written for non-magicians called Tricks of the Mind, which I think is really, a really, really interesting book. And there's also another book. I think it's called Elephants on Acid, which I loved, which is all about kind of scientific experiments. I mean, really, I'm just trying to think of the most like inspiring things. Like for me, like Wes Anderson films.
Yeah.
That is such a magical fairy tale universe that he creates in there visually. And that's something that always, it's definitely like an inspiration. We're obviously nowhere near like anything as amazing as sort of what he does. But certainly like in that sort of, in our videos, like we try and have like there's a little bit of, it's awkward. It's something a bit weird, going on. And so like, but I think his clarity, but then also aesthetic and kind of super kind of controlled environment. I mean, Wes Anderson is like, if you've seen any of like the behind the scenes stuff,
God,
this guy is laser focused.
Isle of Dogs is crazy, right?
Yeah. Right. So I think his like insane control, and I think it's tricky for us as a studio because we kind of have that, and it's sometimes quite hard to work internally to work together. I think we're quite good to work with, but internally because we really push ourselves to kind of for that clarity and precision. And when there's so many things we haven't put out because we're just not quite happy with the way we're sort of telling it or documenting it. But I think that's super, super inspiring from a sort of storytelling kind of aesthetic point of view. And the Darren Brown books, mainly just because of his, all about how we perceive an experience and the sort of stuff we were talking about at the beginning. I mean, he is just such an incredible magician and performer. And unfortunately, there are other magician things that you can't get a hold of, which kind of go on, kind of go into some of the things that he's doing. But I think that, and then I read a lot of nerdy blogs. I read Hacker News like religiously 3 times a day. I'm always looking out for kind of just weird kind of stories. But I actually find Hacker News just to be it's a blog by Y Combinator, and there's a lot of stuff on there that I don't understand. I mean, there's some really weird, obscure programming language things, but there's something really magical about that blog and the kind of things it pulls up. There'll be like obscure stories about whales on Wikipedia, all sorts of different kind of things. And I think that's just such a nice kind of, manageable feed of unexpected information that keeps kind of bombarding me throughout the day. So I read, Hacker News, Darren Brown books, Wes Anderson films. And there's so many other things, I'm sure, but I just can't think of them at the moment. I really experiencing stuff, just going out, being around people. I mean, like I kind of mentioned that before, but that's the most inspiring thing. Our projects are so different. So like you said, we're not experts in any kind of field other than, creating things that people experience, which is really vague. But we've worked on theme parks, actually designing theme park, like a whole theme park, medical products, lots of tech products, all sorts of different things, and for very different types of people. And I think the thing that kind of unites all those projects is just kind of curiosity and kind of respect for the people that we're designing for, and just that kind of desire to be like a sponge and just go out and kind of absorb as much as we can about a topic, and then kind of bring it all together nicely.
I mean, yeah, I got to say that's a great conclusion, and I mean it almost feels like they always say the saying of you are what you eat. It feels like your diet of information and stimulus is so rich that it doesn't in any way sort of demystify or break the quality of what you do to say that, but I think it does underscore that there's actually just a lot of sheer commitment that you take to what you do, to have the imaginative leap to go somewhere that no one's gone before with a particular design or experience. It is because you put the groundwork in meeting those people, reading those weird blogs, buying those weird little things that have got nothing to do with anything at the time, and then suddenly click into focus. So I really think you've done an amazing job of like deconstructing, and it's hard to do that about yourself. So I can't thank you enough for your time, and also the transparency. It was very revealing.
Absolute pleasure, Jude, and I can't wait to dig into all the kind of interviews you've done. I'm definitely going to listen to them as I'm doing my daily walk, daily permitted coronavirus walk.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
Well, look, thanks again, and
Awesome.
take care of yourself. And I'm sure I'll have another call. It sounds weird. You want to say see you around, but you haven't got the vocabulary these days. But look, take care, man, and thanks again.
Take care. See you
Bye.
later. Bye.